Africa, its 54 countries make up 28% of the United Nations. With strategic sea and airports, abundant land and mineral resources, corrupt elections and leaders, and a growing population. Journalists Matibe, Sargis Sangari, and Doug Burton join us to discuss the increasing tactical importance of Africa, how China is using it to fuel its ambitions, and how the U.S. is responding. Welcome to International Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Cindy Drucker. Our conversations bring together investigative journalists from around the world. They'll help us to uncover hidden information, details of conflicts, alliances, and connections in a deep dive discussion. Suddenly, eyes are on Africa. First Lady Dr. Jill Biden on a diplomatic tour. Contested elections in Nigeria all over Twitter. China and Russia conducting joint military exercises with South Africa. Why all the attention? What makes Africa so essential at this time to the global power balance? Time to meet our panel. Today we have with us Doug Burton, a veteran conflict reporter. Doug spent decades with the Washington Times Court before joining U.S. State Department in Iraq from 2005 to 2007. Returning to journalism, he covered the campaign against ISIS, later switching his focus to terrorism in Nigeria, where he currently mentors a team of grassroots reporters. He and team members were featured in a Fox Nation documentary on Nigeria in 2021. Next, Matibe, a native of Zimbabwe. Pearl earned international attention covering then-President Robert Mugabe's land reform violence. Today, she's a State Department and White House correspondent focusing on U.S. strategy towards China and Russia. Her work appears across the world, including in Defense Web, The Mail and Guardian, BBC World Service, and Newsday Zimbabwe. She's also the author of a riveting memoir, Defining Pearl. And Sargis Sangari, an Iranian-born Assyrian, Sargis spent 20 years in the U.S. military, retiring as a lieutenant colonel in the Army Special Operations Forces. He shares his deep and unique perspective on geopolitics and national security as host of the weekly podcast, New Paradigms, live every Monday at 9 p.m. Eastern. His writings can be found in Japan Forward, the Western Free Press, and the Daily Herald. Welcome, everyone. To set the stage for this discussion of big power influence on the continent of Africa, I just want to recap Africa's colonial past for the audience. The 3 decades leading up to World War I was known as the Scramble for Africa, during which the continent went from roughly 10% colonized to nearly 90%, divided between 7 Western European powers. Then in the 1950s, decolonization began, and today, Africa is a continent of 54 sovereign states. But the scramble to exert influence over Africa's 1.4 billion people is ever present, and that's what we're going to focus on today. Doug, can you start by giving us a sketch of China's involvement in Africa? How big is it? What are Beijing's intentions? What does it look like?
Thank you, Cindy. For China, Africa is the theater for projection of its power for decades, and in fact, China's aim is to gain supremacy in the world economically and politically, and to replace the United States as the single world superpower. So Africa is very much a part of this project. And unlike the United States, China really prioritizes African nations and has been engaged with these countries for decades. So Africa is going to be a very wealthy continent, and it is going to be the labor supply for the world in about 20 years. By 2050, Africa will be the second largest continent. Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa, will be possibly the second largest country in the world by 2050. It will be second only to India, because China has an aging population, Nigeria, and all of the 53 African nations have rapidly growing populations. So China has been busy for decades setting up port agreements, building roads, and especially standing behind a very ambitious $1 trillion project called the Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to make its endpoint in Morocco, in Casablanca, and it has recently opened up a $1.5 billion port in Lagos, Nigeria, which will be the transportation hub for all of Africa. So African nations, the 54 votes in the United Nations, are key as a place for China to experiment with investments financially, soft power as well as hard power. And I think the U.S. State Department is realizing that it has got to do a lot of catch up to be a competitor.
All right, so I'd like to ask Pearl about that. Seems like China is pouring a lot of money and infrastructure into Africa. What's the nature of U.S. involvement in Africa right now, and is it growing? There's a lot of attention, as I said in the intro, to Africa these days that we haven't really seen recently.
Well, Cindy, as a precursor to that, I will just state this, that President Biden did launch his national security strategy. And the number one threat to the United States listed in the strategy is China. So as we look at the United States grand strategy, for many years it was focused on the Middle East and terrorism. But they made a strategic shift to now focus on the Indo-Pacific. And since President Biden came into power, he personally, as I heard the U.S. ambassador to South Africa, Ambassador Brigitte, say just the other day, and I'll just quote exactly what he said here. He said that the president is personally invested in Africa, that he has given specific instructions to his senior leadership to ramp up efforts, to strengthen partnerships. And last August, his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, traveled to South Africa to launch the president's Sub-Saharan Africa strategy. So this strategy is focused on, quote, to play a critical role in advancing global priorities to the benefit of both Africans and Americans. Cindy.
Pearl, what does that actually mean? We heard that from Doug that China is, building infrastructure, bringing in money in that way. So what does this interaction actually look like for America?
Well, as we take a look, right, so President Biden came into office early 2021. Prior to that, we had former Secretary of State Michael Pompeo. And if you compare the amount of travel that, for example, State Department officials, senior Biden-Harris administration officials made during former Secretary Rex Tillerson's tenure and Michael Pompeo's tenure, and you compare those to just the sheer amount of travel that is happening under the Biden administration, that travel has increased more than 3 times. So in this comparison, I would say compare between 2017 to right now, 2023, as you know, even after Secretary of State Antony Blinken went to South Africa this year already, Secretary Yellen, our Treasury Secretary, already has traveled to the continent. U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, has also been on the continent. Last December, President Biden hosted 49 African leaders here in Washington at the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, and he promised them that this year he was going to send more high-ranking members of his administration to Africa, including, as we just saw last week, his wife, the First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden, visited Namibia and South Africa. That was a precursor to the president's own visit. We will see coming up, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is also going to travel to the continent, as will Vice President Kamala Harris, and then the president himself plans to be on the continent likely this summer, Cindy.
Okay, so a lot of attention there, and I guess we'll wait and see exactly what it means tangibly. Sargis, I want to ask you, how does Russia fit into all of this? South Africa recently participated in military exercises with China and Russia, which is was heavily criticized in the U.S. because, of course, South Africa is seen as an ally, and it coincided with the one-year anniversary on the war in Ukraine. So, of course, it's being interpreted as supporting Russia in that conflict, although South Africa says it's neutral. But it's still quite significant. So how does Russia factor into all of this?
Well, I would say that nobody's neutral in this type of a fight. Everybody's making their economic deals right now on the ground. Keep in mind that going back now a decade ago when Wang Yi stood at the Brookings Institute and presented the idea of what the global vision for China was between the relationship of the United States and China itself and his basically new power relations speech, Susan Rice at that time did not counter it at George Washington University, but actually talked about how to actualize it. So how Russia fits into this piece is that Russia belongs to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is led by China. And now we have to look at Africa. Africa presents the shortest air route, really, to the American hemisphere. And keep in mind that during World War II, we did ferry supplies to the Allies using the routes through South America. It is a short hop, and we must always remember that the strategic resources of that region, uranium, diamonds, rare earth minerals, and those elements, Africa does present a treasure trove for all these CCP-led countries, to include Russia, and they will not gonna allow the Americans to be able to, or the Africans profit from those resources. Of course, really the main elephant in the room is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So the United States and their allies have to catch up in this game of economic battles. And the SCO, as you know, has pretty much secured as much as it can, currently focused on the groundwork it's doing in Central Asia region with Iran, India, Pakistan, and of course Afghanistan, which we left coming into the mix, Russia and the Central Asian republics. Africa now would fall within the SCO sphere of influence and control, which means that unfettered access for Iran and Russia into the African affairs and the U.S. sanctions on such regimes as the Iranian and Russians would face a counter in Africa, and could delay the timelines to end what we believe is a European conflict that is based on breaking Russia and the SCO when it comes to being able to counter the sanctions that we have placed on them in order to be able to bring a resolution to this war.
So, Doug, let me ask you, are the pressures right now, or the focus on Africa, is that about securing alliances? How do African nations see it? What do they want out of the relationships with, say, China or the U.S.?
Well, Cindy, the African nations want to trade both ways. They're looking for the best deal they can get with China or the United States. So Nigeria is a U.S. ally, but Nigeria has China as its major trading partner. And it's using China to get financing for major infrastructure projects, including roads and pipelines, almost everything that is essential to the development of this country. Now, China presents itself as the world's largest developing country, although I don't think it's worthy of that label. I think it is a developed country. And it says that it has a natural bond to the 54 developing countries in Africa. So that's its calling card.
And Pearl, is America late to the game in terms of realizing this or trying to gain alliances? How is the U.S. handling it, and what do they hope to get out of the relationship?
That's an excellent question, Cindy. So if we take a look back at the context here, the background, for many years and for subsequent U.S. presidents and bipartisan, both Republicans and Democrats, Africa was not really ever top of the agenda for the United States. So what has changed? As we are seeing in Europe, we have a major war going on in Ukraine now over a year ago. And just after that war started, there was a major United Nations General Assembly vote on March 2nd of 2022. What happened then? Why was this significant? Why does it even matter? Well, that vote was asking member states to rebuke aggression against Ukraine. And the resulting votes, there were 141 votes in favor. So 73% of member countries voted for this, and then 5 were against. It was about 48% of them abstained. So 48.6% of the abstentions were African. So this is a major voting bloc. If you take a look at what Africa represents, as you rightly said earlier, and my colleagues did too here, Doug, I think did too, the 28% total African representation in the United Nations General Assembly is a salient fact in US-Africa relations. And so I can tell you that back in December at the US-Africa Leaders Summit, I had many conversations and interviewed one-on-one members of the Biden administration at the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit last year. One of these people was a spokesperson at the State Department, Nathaniel Tech. And this is what he said to me, quote, he said, "We're hosting this summit," and this was in recognition of Africa's role and importance. He said, quote, "Africa is a major geopolitical player. It is the future of international relations in the 21st century. It's a vibrant continent, it's a dynamic continent, and Africa is now at the forefront of numerous shared core challenges." And one of those things that we need to recognize is South Africa is the only African country in the G20. None of the other countries are represented. South Africa was also invited to the G7 last year as an observer nation. One thing that we want to take a look at, if you take a look at the United Nations Security Council, right, the P5, look at the makeup of that body. About 80% of that body is not African. And yet look at the makeup of the global population. So that 80% is not representative of the globe, of the world's population here on planet Earth. So even if you separate out China and just say Russia, the United States, and the others in that P5, even if you separate out China, China holds then 20% of the United Nations Security Council, and these countries are the ones making the decision for everybody else on planet Earth. Right, so it's not representative.
And Africa has over a quarter of the voting bloc in the UN, so also not representative in that sense in terms of member nations. Sargis, I want to ask you, one of the other pieces of the puzzle, of course, is instability in many African nations and extremism, Muslim China violence, Muslim Christian violence. How does that factor into how, I'm assuming support for some extremist groups comes from China, Russia, Iran. So how does that change the dynamics in terms of how the big powers see Africa and where where the wedges are, where the leverage is?
Well, it doesn't matter how the great powers see it. Like I said, somewhat they agreed when Wang Yi's vision proposed that going back a decade ago now that we were going to go ahead and basically compete in Africa, right? But the Western powers saw it as a economic competition, which is nice and clean. But China doesn't see it that way. You know, China has a different version. So first of all, we need to really kind of focus on the tragedy that will happen in Africa and what it means if that particular continent now comes under the sway of the Chinese Communist Party. As you know, it will be a massive humanitarian crisis. The CCP has no qualms about ethnic cleansing, starting wars, genocides. Besides, they have a good PR team and can cover it up from their perspective and can bribe anybody they want on their way to cover up those consequences. So look at what happened in South Sudan. The CCP mirrored what I believe in South Sudan, what it did and what they did in Burma. using their techniques of ethnic cleansing, using local puppet governments, leaders, security networks to secure those pipelines and ports. I wrote an article on this in a white paper for the National Security Council about what happened in the Arakan region of Burma and how it was really connected via, at that time, the Burmese General Halang to China itself. They could duplicate that here, as they were killing and flooding Rohingya refugees throughout entire Southeast Asia because of those CCP operations to use refugees as a means to control the region. They're going to do the same thing in Africa. In 2018, when I visited northern and southern Thailand, I looked into what had happened in that particular conflict. And in 2017, you had over 65,000 people that were forced from their homes. As you see, even in South Sudan and other places, at least 6,000 killed. And I come to find out that the crisis was really tied not to the government on the ground, or whether it be African or in this case Burmese government policies, but it was really the ties that exist between the military at that time and the Chinese companies that were operating in the Arakan region, trying to remove the Rohingya and the other non-Burmese groups from the region. And a year to the date when I wrote that white paper, what happens, you have the coup that takes place in Burma, coups that can take place in Africa, and the Chinese were able to establish their own government in the region, working for them and for their interests. So in the Arakan region, which is a remote, impoverished region in the far west of the country of Burma, because of the CCP, they were able to really put their largest expansion projects within those regions. The Chinese government consortium known as CITIC, which operates the Chinese International Trust Investment Corporation in Africa, many places, is streamrolling a $14 billion project in that region, where it is building a deep water port and is able to also bring oil transports and processing facilities in order to be able to design those projects to be able to take deliveries from the Middle East and pipeline it directly to China. It does the same thing in Africa. If Africa understands, what would happen if that happens in Africa, if the CCP now shift from economic dominance to now ethnic cleansing, to remove unwanted populations from their strategic assets. The humanitarian crisis and the refugee pressures will potentially cascade beyond Africa into the Middle East and possibly into Europe, which the Shanghai Cooperation Organization would be in favor of in order to counter the United States, in order to ensure that the United States falls back.
Getting close to the end here. Doug, so one of the take-homes I get from what Sargis just said is that, China's basically an enabler of corruption, of genocide, whereas the U.S. is usually wanting to see more, good governance, human rights. What chance does the U.S. have in winning over African leaders if these are the two options?
The United States has a good chance if it will actively and sincerely engage with these countries and help them develop their infrastructure, not only economically, but in terms of human rights and civil society. I think the United States talks about that, but they're not really focused on it. They're chiefly focused on trade. But right now, the United States stands to lose its base with Nigeria, for example, the largest country, because Nigeria just had a watershed, high-stakes election on February 25, and it looks like it was a stolen election. There are widespread allegations, credible allegations, that it was a illegal fraud, voter looting kind of election. So the United States relationship will be destabilized if it is propping up a government that doesn't have legitimacy through a democratic process. And if that's the case, it's a warning, and it's a bad sign, because Nigeria is very influential throughout Western Africa. What happens in Nigeria is likely to spread to surrounding countries. So the United States considers democracies its allies always. China can work very well, as Sargis said. they can work very well with non-democratic authoritarian regimes. That benefits them, and then they come in and clean up the spoils.
Okay, so we have about 30 seconds left. So Pearl, to you, what do you think we should be paying the closest attention to, if there's one thing?
We should be paying close attention to the upcoming 2023 elections in Zimbabwe. I can tell you that right now, State Department Ambassador, Assistant Secretary Robert Scott is on the ground in Harare at the moment. We should also be paying attention to the Salafi jihadist concerns. The United States is very concerned about the violent extremism in the Sahel. I've spoken to, the Deputy Coordinator, Regional Multilateral Affairs there, Greglila Gerfo, who has touched on that. And yesterday we were briefed by the U.S. Africa Commander, Michael Langley. He just recently attended the defense chiefs. We should be paying attention to what AFRICOM is doing, for example, in Somalia, and what the United States is doing with its allies such as the United Kingdom, Canada, and other European countries. Right now, on the ground, President of France, Emmanuel Macron, is also on the ground right now visiting Gabon, Angola, and a couple of other countries. The German Chancellor is in Washington today, meeting with President Biden. I did ask the Biden-Harris administration yesterday if they're going to touch on Africa, so we will want to monitor that, because Germany itself is ramping up its own Africa strategy. So,
all right, I've got to stop us here. Thank you all so much. An extremely interesting discussion. I'm sure we could go on all day, but we are out of time. So, Doug, Pearl, Sargis, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And finally, to all of you brave journalists out there, honoring our golden rule: seek the truth and report on it. Thank you. I'm Cindy Drucker. Thank you for joining us on International Reporters Roundtable. Until next time.